Okay, started the record.
Perfect. Welcome everyone who's here live, and if you couldn't make it live, welcome from the future. We're really excited to get this going. I think that big picture there are two main goals. One is to make the best blue black list that we can, and the second is to kind of teach people at least one approach for more focused testing for a high level event. So I think something I never realized is one of the biggest gaps between the pros and just like normal everyday players is how they prepare for events. Um, and I think that there's a bit of a barrier to entry in that you need other players who are just as committed as you to the event, to be able to use these like more focused methods of testing. But I think with the MurkGuides Discord, we kind of have that available to us. So with that in mind, we're able to run a more targeted level of testing that's gonna give you like a better return on your time and kind of help you prepare more effectively for the RC. And I kind of I stole these some of these testing methods from pro tour teams, so they're definitely effective. And I think that by doing this together, I think hopefully it gives you a better chance to do well at this RC, but also at future RCs, even if it's not modern and you're not testing with the MurkGuides. Like at least now you have this model in your head of a good way to prepare, and you can hopefully rally some of your crew to do that as well. So that's big picture. But kind of getting into the details, I think that there are a couple things we need to focus on in regards to this specific RC, which is preparing for a few key matchups. So determining what those matchups are, I think, is a top priority because you can't boil the ocean in modern. There's just too many matchups. Like you can't have a plan for every matchup. I love it when people ask like what the plan is to play against Merfolk, and I'm unless your LGS has Nikachu, you're not gonna have a plan for Merfolk. It's too many archetypes in modern. Um, but picking out which those key matchups are and then figuring out plans against them is a really good foundation. And then the other thing I think is worth discussing is the build of blue black, because now we've seen a change in the meta where energy is still probably the most played deck, but its power level has come down certainly, without Amped Raptor and the One Ring. And Frog has risen a lot in the meta. And so there's been a lot of changes. Of course, also there was the unbans, Rip Twin, guys. I mean, pour one out. It's not looking good, but I'm still working on Twin. Just I think that the focus for the RC should be on blue black. It's clearly a very strong deck. Um, but yeah, I think with the shifts in the meta, we have to re-question how we're building blue black. Psychic Frog is the core of the deck, but do you want Oculus and Unearth or move back to a more traditional Murktide build? So we're gonna have some discussion on that as well, which I think is gonna be a good starting place, and we'll have to test those theories. So that's gonna be a part of our testing as well. Um, yeah, Pi, do you have? I just talked a lot, but do you have anything to add, or we could just get into the discussion if not?
Yeah, I think I'm happy to share this method of testing, mostly because I think it's something very valuable, not only for what we teach in terms of blue black, but also for being a better player in the future. So it's both good for the short run and the long run. And yeah, regarding the meta, I think it's funny because even on the single blue black deck, there are a lot of different takes. And today we try to make clarification on like the reasons why, for example, I like to play without counter spells and without Murktide, while you are kind of the opposite in terms of deck building and stuff like that. So yeah, I think this is just the introduction. Now we can just get to the real content.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so step one, I think we could have a little bit of a discussion on blue black and the pros and cons of the two different builds. I in preparation for this event last night, I played a league and went 5-0, and I beat two blue black decks that were playing Oculus in the process, so that was a little bit validating. But I think part of this process is like recognizing leagues are imperfect because you're not really able to, you know the quality of your opponent, but you're also not able to discuss the matchup. So maybe my opponent, drew really bad, and I just, I can't see their hands, so it's hard for me to know what's in their hand. But for us, I think we can actually focus test, the pseudo mirror as a key matchup to understand, because I expect Frog to be the number one or number two deck, and then Energy being the other number one or number two deck. Like understanding how different that matchup plays depending on Murktide versus Oculus with the current energy lists is going to be another top priority. Um, I know, Pi, you had some opinions on like the differences, so if you could explain those to
Yeah,
people, and then I'll add
so
any thoughts I have.
okay, so yeah, basically I think my list is a bit unorthodox in terms of deck building because I'm not playing neither Counterspell or Murktide. So I found myself losing a lot when I am on the draw because I keep drawing those clunky cards that requires 2 mana at least to be cast. And I think like playing Thugscour doesn't really help a lot of the time because you can mill Oculus, but you can also mill something irrelevant. And sometimes, like if you do nothing, and then play Oculus, it's not easy that you win the game. So like the level 0 of my testing and my ideas is I wanted more more 1 mana counter spells. So I added a third spell snare. I think a lot of players play 1 or 2. I want to play 3 because I think that is the best replacement for counterspell right now. As you said, like the biggest contenders are Blue Black Frog and Boros, and I think Spell Snare is actually very strong versus Boros because all the problematic threats cost 2, because you can push or just race Ocelot and Guide of Souls, but you really need to counter Ajani and you really need to counter Goblin Bombardment because otherwise those cards can run away with the game. And versus Frog, again, you really need to counter at least a Frog because sometimes even if you let it resolve and push it, they can still discard Oculus or discard enough cards to then play Oculus. And of course I don't play counterspell, so it's not super easy that I can resolve that other threat. And in Stern Scolding I found it very strong even versus Breach. Oh, of course, versus Breach Spell Snare is awesome because you counter Malevolent Rumble, that is like the enabler you must counter because it fuels their combo, finds their piece, and also is a good way to give them Delirium for an only hit. So if you counter Rumble, you're usually fine. And also counters Breach for 1 mana, that is huge because sometimes they really need to have all their mana to work accordingly because you need to play that, they need to play another spell, and also sometimes they also need to play Grinding Station. So I found Snare to be optimal, but also Scolding. Scolding is of course amazing versus Boros because it counters everything. Sometimes you counter like Seasoned Pyromancer, and like this mana trade is huge. But also like you can counter Emry and counter Tamillo that are very problematic to answer, considering we just play only 4 Fatal Push and sometimes one shoot the Sheriff, while being also relevant in the mirror because you can counter the Frog. And also I like to have 1 or 2 Pierces. Of course it's a card that I just added last minute, but the reason is when you unearth an Oculus you usually have more than 1 mana, so you can immediately like counter a Fatal Push, especially if it's early game. While I think
you should share your list. Actually, I realized
Yeah.
if you're gonna, well, yeah.
Okay. Let me. So yeah, I added a couple other cards, but like the like I have a couple of unorthodox cards I'm testing, but besides those, I just have like this amount of 1 mana counters. And they also found that Thoxis is the best counterspell replacement because you deal with a threat, but this also costs 1 mana, and again it's good on the draw because like versus Frog, you'd rather have Thoxis than counterspell on the draw because you can Thoxis the Frog, you can Thoxis Unearth, etc. Same versus like a lot of decks, and also like I
think
found I would finish very soon. But yeah,
yeah, sure.
I ended up Thoxising myself a couple of times. That is actually relevant. Like on turn 2, Thoxis plus Unearth after your opponent just did nothing, and you immediately have Oculus. Like it won me a couple of games. Even you can even Thoxis on turn 1, and then have like Unearth plus Pierce or Unearth plus Snare, and be fine. Like this happens like versus Breach. It occurs a lot because if versus Breach you need to slam a threat fast and then counter the first layer of permanents, and then you should win. I think like being able to do this move, I don't think it's of course that you usually focus this yourself, but having this upside is huge.
Yeah. When playing the Oculus builds, there have been times where on the draw I go to discard, and it's happened more than once to me. You have to know the matchup, of course, but like if the Oculus is going to be uncontested, then just going to discard turn one and then turn two, play a land, unearth it's very, very strong. Sometimes, but I think on the topic of Thoughtseize, this is like a big one. For both deck lists. Like I also want to play Thoughtseize in my list. Um, I think that the big point to drive home is that Thoughtseize, I think its biggest weakness was energy. Previously, especially with the old builds. Um, Two things. One is that energy is an aggro deck, but then two is that Thoughtseize isn't very good against any deck playing the One Ring because if they just top deck the One Ring, then like everything you did is undone. So now that both of those problems are gone, I think Thoughtseize is like super strong. And then the most important thing is just making sure that you're not hurting yourself too much. So I think that looking at the mana base again is potentially worth it. I see you've adapted 2 Dark Slick Shores. I have 2 Dark Slick Shores. I might even try to push it up to 3, but like Thoughtseize in this more combo meta, right? Where we have like the Breach deck, and then we have more linear decks like Eldrazi and Belcher is still around. Thoughtseize is super, super strong for us because it also just gives us the information of what's in our opponent's hand. And being able to craft your own plan around that is good. So maybe at some point we can do Thoughtseize 101. I'm not sure, if people have been playing blue red their whole life, then maybe they're not as experienced with the card Thoughtseize, and it can be a tricky one to resolve, but there's a lot of advantage to seeing their hand and then being able to craft a plan around that. So I absolutely think Thoughtseize is like a very strong upgrade that we are able to play in this meta. That's a good one to call out. Um, yeah, I think that Pi covered the Oculus build very well. I think like taking a step back, the way I see it is the Oculus build has a couple advantages. I think that it is going to be slightly better against Boros, just because Oculus lines up better into um, like the Boros removal spells compared to Murktide. Murktide, if they just have Static Prison, uh, it's really poor for us. But Oculus, like at least you get to manifest once. But also if the Static Prison ever goes away, then like the Oculus is going to be better to have back than the Murktide. So that's always felt very impactful. The other advantage to Oculus is just the explosiveness of the deck. Like you have the opportunity to make plays like turn 2 Unearth Oculus. In the Murktide version, you aren't gonna have those plays, right? Like you can, with my build, you can never play Murktide turn 2. Very rarely will you even play Murktide turn 3. Um, but then on the flip side, if you're asking like what are the advantages to the Murktide play, the Murktide list, I would tell you that I think there is an edge to be had in the mirror, just based on the removal spell. So I put my Murktide list in the chat for this call. Maybe you can flip that open, or I
Yeah,
can share
I
my
was
screen.
looking at your Twitter, like this one.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. Yeah. Here we go. So with this list, I think my theory, at least, that's been playing out, is that your favorite in the mirror, because Murktide Regent is a big trump card with the current deck lists. A lot of deck lists have maybe one Shoot the Sheriff, and then 4 Fatal Push as removal spells. So Murktide very difficult for them to answer. Conversely, if you have Fatal Push, you get to Fatal Push their Oculus. So that should go in your favor about your removal spells lining up better than the opponent's. Um, the other thing is you're not playing cards like Thought Scour. So I mean, Thought Scour is like, and I see Pygonti has started to cut scours as well, but it's just tricky. I mean, the Oculus deck really wants you to get creatures into the graveyard for Unearth, and it, I think, can be inconsistent in doing so. It's not super inconsistent, but there are certainly times where you're kind of stuck with Oculus in hand, or Unearth in hand and no creature in the graveyard to unearth. And the Murktide deck avoids those problems. I mean, the most awkward you get, run into is drawing 2 Murktides and not being able to cast both of them. But generally, you're gonna have less like quote unquote bad cards like Unearth or Scour, cards that are like very situational in their power level or have a wide range of outcomes. Um, so I think that's a big advantage. And then I guess just bigger picture, also like Murktide plays very nicely against linear decks compared to Oculus when you're not unearthing. So a problem that I ran into against like Mono Blue Belcher, for example, is if I did not draw thoughts, or if I did not mill an Oculus, like I had Oculus in hand, it was very hard for me to play it because I also wanted to leave up counter magic at that point. With Murktide Regent, the 1 mana less makes a big difference. Like on turn 4, you can play a Murktide Regent and have up Counterspell. You can have on 3 mana, you can have up a Consign to Memory at least. So that 1 mana actually is a big difference maker. Like you might not, it doesn't always sound like it, but it does make a big difference. So against those linear decks, like that play pattern of Murktide hold up Counterspell is a really, really strong one that I think this version would do better. So maybe flipping back to the sheet, the Google sheet, I made like we made a matchup matrix, kind of trying to like look at a high level of what the pros and cons are. Now that intangible like explosiveness factor is hard to put on a matrix, but it is something to keep in mind, right? Of like if we feel that in the matchups that we play testing the Murktide version that you're always falling behind and that it's hard to catch up, like that's something to remember, is that the Oculus deck does a better job of playing to the board. I think that's a point that Pygonti made, is like the Oculus deck can really play to the board and be more aggressive compared to the Murktide builds. So that's something like intangible you kind of have to keep an eye out for. But in terms of like purely analyzing matchups, this
Yeah,
is, I think, a starting point
I'm not sure
for
I
understanding
agree.
the pros and cons.
I'm not sure I agree on everything, but like yes, I found myself a lot, like especially in the mirror. I found that when I played at least similar to yours, I was losing to the top deck of Unearthed because like each time I kill something, they unearth it, and it's like they have more threats. While a single Murktide, of course, is bigger than whatever my list does, but it seems like I do a better job of building a board. So sometimes you just fall behind. I see you beat two mirrors here, so maybe that can be an interesting point. And yeah, like I think just there are pros and cons in both lists. Like of course, because we play a different game, especially versus Belcher and Grinding Breach, I think with my list I am the aggressor, even versus Eldrazi, because I can play a better, like my threats are faster, and I can just start to apply pressure even on turn 2. I think I'm more aggressive on slamming the frog, because I have force, I have 1 mana counter magic eventually, so I can just put the creatures onto the battlefield and then start to win with those, while your list is a bit more like like you really want to pass with counter spells up. That's why I think it makes sense for you to have Bowmasters, because at least you don't waste the mana when you hold up counter spell.
Yeah, that's a good point. The other thing about Bowmasters is I think it's just improved a little bit in positioning. Like one thing I said about Bowmasters beforehand, before the bans, was that the only matchup I thought Bowmasters was good against was the Mirror. So now that the Mirror has, blown up quite a bit as one of the most popular decks, like obviously there's an incentive to play Bowmasters, and not every blue black frog player is going to be in this testing group, so not everyone will have Bowmasters. There's lots of lists with like 0 or 1 or 2, but having the extra copies of Bowmasters will give you an edge there. Um, but also like energy, I've seen energy lists playing 2 to 4 season Pyromancer. Bowmasters is fantastic against that. Same with like Fable of the Mirrorbreaker. Of course, Bowmasters is good against Faithless Looting decks, which there are, some miscellaneous amount of Faithless Looting decks that have been going around. And then
it's relevant versus Breach also, because like they can't really loop bubbles with Embry. So I don't think the card is very good in Mirror, because a lot of the times they play Scour, you play Bowmaster, and then they play Unearth, and But yeah, versus Boros is incredible. And versus Breach is also relevant. So yeah, I like how the card feels in those kind of lists. I think like
so there's a note. We need to test Bowmasters in the Mirror because Pygonti and I disagree.
yeah, I'm happy to play a couple of games if we have time. And I
this
think
is like the type of this is the type of stuff that we should take note of as we work on the testing server, is whenever there are disagreements in opinion, that's like something you'd want to test in on. And one way to do that is we can play a list with 4 Bowmaster versus a list with no Bowmaster and see how that plays out. But um these types of things are important to figure out, right? Because if
yes.
Bowmasters is good in the Mirror versus bad in the Mirror, that makes a big difference on whether I would want to play the card in this meta personally. Um, so yeah, we should test that. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, also like I think a couple of I think in this list I want to play at least one Archmage's Charm, maybe over the Borrower or over an Harbinger. I found Archmage's Charm to be strong because it's very strong in the Mirror, because you can just pass with mana up and start to do card advantage. And also like it's relevant versus Breach because sometimes you get to steal a resolved Tamio and like you win the game immediately. But it's also strong versus Boros because versus Boros is a lot of the times is a resource game. So being able to draw 2 or like steal something is at times very good. And eventually you can even counter Flage like or Fable or Spyro. Since their curve is higher now, I think it's fine to play one or two charms, probably in the main. And yeah, then I like the Spellbomb in the main. I think Spellbomb is the best graveyard 8 piece. That's why I'm playing 3 in the sideboard. And playing in the main is probably smart because it's good versus the best 3 decks that are Oculus, Breach, and Boros. And you side it in. And then eventually it's good versus random decks, like it's good versus Eldrazi because you slow the Remnant cooldown. It's good versus like Amulet for the line of the analyst line is good versus like a lot of decks. So it's just a cantrip that turns out Fatal Push. Like it's not obvious why this card is in the main, so I want to make a clarification. But yeah, it's very strong.
It's very strong, and I I almost have wanted a second in the main, but there is a factor of it being potentially a little clunky. But like when you build against energy, I think that it's important to have like coverage for Flage, which is why in my list I had one of the one copy of Dreams of Steel and Oil, which exiles Flage, and then one copy of Spellbomb.
Yeah.
That card is just the card that beats you so frequently. And so I think having pre-board like some amount of plan against it is helpful. Uh, and then Spellbomb, like Paiganti said, I mean here he just summed it up. It's just good against all the top decks right now. And at worst it can trips for 2, which is when you don't have card when you have I think when you have less cards that are dependent on each other, you're able to play that. Like in a list with Oculus, if you have an opening hand, for example, with Unearth and Spellbomb and all these other cards, it just gets very clunky. So I would be interested to see if like the Oculus deck can support playing
Yeah.
Spellbomb. But in my list, where like most of your spells are pretty castable early on, like you can afford to have the Spellbomb. It feels pretty easily. But yeah, we should test like Spellbomb in all of our lists, I think, and just see how it's feeling.
Also, like, last thing about Spellbomb in this list is funny because you can Spellbomb yourself when you have Murktide. So sometimes you
Yep,
you,
you
you
can.
get the coolest lethal.
Yeah, I mean that can be a big deal. Sometimes your graveyard just piles up, and if you exile all the cards, your Murktide gets to be like a 20/20.
Yeah.
So it happens. It comes up. Cool. So I think maybe flipping back to the Google Doc, we can continue there. I think now maybe we should open it up to FAQ or just like to get patrons' opinions. Um, One thing is we want to structure this, program to whatever is helpful for you. So after this call concludes, I'm going to post a Google form, um, like a survey in the focus testing channel, and I would like to get all of your perspectives, kind of on both what matchups you feel are the most difficult or you want to learn more about, and then also, as we look to set up testing, it's going to be important to find players who are willing to play villains. So it's not always the most fun to play villain, but it's very helpful for the team, and ultimately, will benefit everyone. And what I mean by playing villain is like we need a player who has experience with energy. We need a player who has experience with grinding breach. All of these matchups. Um, and myself and Paiganti will try to fill in where we can. I think we have some experience with those decks as well, but there's only 2 of us and there's a lot more of you guys. So if we can get it to the point where we have a couple people who are willing to play villain, then that would be beneficial. Um, but yeah, so let's I guess starting I and people can I guess is there like a raise hand feature or no? No, there's not. I should have thought about that.
I mean,
Um,
if
people
someone has
people
any
can feel
question,
free.
you can just unmute and ask, and we can take care of that.
Yeah, let's start. What matchups? I mean, I've kind of proposed my matrix, or you can type them in chat. I guess is another another option. But um, I've proposed. I think that energy is a good matchup to focus on. I think that the mirror is a good one. Grinding breach is a good one. Does anyone have any other thoughts?
Oh, I see someone is typing in chat. Okay, so I want to answer. Okay, I can see the name, but someone asked, are those lists mutually exclusive? Where is the one combining both Oculus and Merc? So I can answer this. So I'm not playing Murktide in my Oculus list, even if a lot of people are doing that, because I found the deck list to be very like not great versus the graveyard 8 cards. And if you analyze all the decks, like Boros is playing Treven Charm in the main, while Breach is playing Soul Guide Lantern, and I think in open deck list a lot of people would just keep a hand with like Soul Guide Lanterns and other stuff, or Treven Charm and other stuff, meaning that playing too many threats that revolves around the graveyard isn't something I'm happy to do, because I think those lists might work in a challenge where, you know, it's closed deck list and it's even like 6 turns or 7 turns, so even if you lose 1 or 2 you can still get in. But in an open deck list tournament things change, so I think playing like 4 Oculus and 3 Murktide is not a good choice. Like it's just that a lot of your hands doesn't really work. And I think like I went on this route even before when Warning was still a thing, and people started to cut the Murktides even before. So I don't know why people just added back the Murktides, because I think the feeling of getting these functional lands is the same.
Okay, leaving some silence to see if anyone has questions that they want to speak up. But I understand in a big call, you might not want to. But that's why we'll do the Google form, is that will leave a place for miscellaneous where people can put their biggest concerns or focuses. Maybe we can talk about like a little bit more generally how the testing program will work.
Yeah, are you reading the chat at the moment?
Oh, no, I'm not. Okay.
Yeah, people just wrote stuff in the chat.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Yeah, let me read the chat. How much Titan do we think we will see? Amulet? It's a good question.
I think
Amulet has. Yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
Okay, so I think the deck would be probably big in Canada, because I know a lot of Canadian people just play the deck, like Domarvey and House of Mana. I don't expect it to be particularly big in Europe, and I don't think the deck is particularly well positioned at the moment, just because like Blue-Black plays Blue Moon in the main, Breach is usually faster, and like a lot of decks are just super prepared to beat Amulet. So I'm not sure. I just don't expect it to be particularly played. Of course, it's still a matchup we should be prepared of, but like if you analyze my list, I play 3 Thoxes, I play Force of Negation Sablet in the main, and like even in the sideboard I have explosives for the amulets consigned to memory. So I think we are and Harbingers, of course. So I think Blue Black is usually fine versus Amulet. Just take the right mulligan decisions and you should be fine. Also, it's even easier now because like my biggest problem versus Amulet is I don't know what 8 are they bringing. So do they have Bojuka Bog? Do they have Cavern of Souls? Do they have Endurance and stuff like that? So I don't know, like I don't expect the deck to be super popular, and I'm not even worried about it.
Yeah, we have, I mean, another matchup where Thoughtseize is going to be very strong. Like, regardless of if they have Cavern or whatever, anything they have, Thoughtseize can pick apart their hands. So we can figure out a plan. I think one thing that maybe some players are less experienced with, but it's a really good skill to have, is like deck list. Because these tournaments are open deck list, making the most of that. So at some point, as we get closer to the actual RCs, we can host a live session where we like practice, looking at deck lists and then making an adaptive sideboard plan because it is very important. Like I see people in chat saying, how many consigned to memories versus amulet? It's a good question, and that's one that I think depends a lot on their list. Like being able to see the deck list and then adapt your sideboard plan is going to be important because if they have 3 defense grid, that makes me much more inclined to want consigned to memory than if they have like no defense grid, for example, just
Yeah,
off the top. So uh I think that'll be like a good session to have as one of our like broader big picture skills sessions. Because I think the plan is we'll do some of these like bigger picture skill sessions, and the goal is to make them more interactive. This has been kind of a lot of us talking at you just to give you a high level idea of how we want to approach this. Um, but in the future, the goal is to make it more interactive because I think that's just more beneficial for you guys. Um, but yeah, so we'll do high level skill sessions and then we'll do focused matchup like deep
yeah.
dive sessions. Pygonti and I are going to bring in like matchup experts as well. So we're going to recruit, people who are very experienced with breach and get their perspective as well as, play some testing matches and record those. Um, so that'll help be like supplemental, guidance or sagely advice on
Yeah.
top of our own testing.
Yeah, I also
Yeah,
like since my RC is before the US one, I can just share everything I learned and everything I discussed with my teammates. Already, like we are recording our sessions, so like getting to that point would be especially useful for US people. But of course, I will provide a deck guide and. Like basically up-to-date content for US, European and Canadian people. So don't worry about that.
yeah, awesome. Um, okay, what else do we need to cover off on for this kickoff?
I think speaking briefly about the best sideboard cards might be
Sure. Yeah,
important
that's a good
because
starting point.
so I think here on the document we just pointed out those 4 cards. I think I can disclose them a little bit better. So I think Mystical Dispute is very very strong at the moment and should be, I think, the premier counter we should play in the sideboard. And especially like if you're playing a lot of cheap counter spells, because Mystical Dispute is like awesome in the mirror. In the mirror, the games don't tend to go very long because, like, of course, you're playing 19 to 20 lands, so being able to play a dispute isn't super like it doesn't occur often, and it's just 1 mana counter spells then, and you can counter spell a counter, a frog on turn 1, an Oculus, a Murktide. But the card is especially good versus Breach because you can counter the threats that are Emery and Tamio, and you can even counter their dispute. So I think I really enjoy the card, and it's a card I want to play at least in 2 copy. I'm playing 3 right now, but I think it's a must to play at least 2. And the card, of course, is generally good versus other decks. Versus any blue deck, this is the best. Like versus Belcher, that I expect to be one of the most played deck because, of course, it's cheap, it's easy to play, and it's a deck that people maybe bought before the One Ring ban. Dispute is immaculate because you can counter Weir of Invention, you can counter Tameshi, and basically everything else. The second card
Any blue spell, yeah, any blue spell that Belcher casts, you're pretty happy to Mystical Dispute,
yes,
honestly.
and
So you just fire.
Yeah,
That's
it's
good.
especially strong because I think like when I used to play Belcher, I played the deck a bit just to see, how it was working because I like the card the Goblin Shell Belcher. So I played the deck for a while, and versus Blue Black, the plan was to cut some Belchers and to cut some Lotus Blooms because of course those cards are kind of cringe versus Consign to Memory because you can't counter a Consign to Memory with Replicate. So like the plan was actually playing Tameshi or playing Wheel of Inventions and then play a longer game. So Dispute is really here to like break their plan. Another card again I want to talk about is Neil Spellbomb, and this card is just awesome because again it's a card that I think is worth main decking at the moment, just because as we said is like the best card among all, and is good versus all the decks. And I think I'm gonna pick this card over any other card that interacts with the graveyard, because I think Surgical sometimes is cringe, especially versus Psychic Frog, because they can just exile the Surgical target. And I don't know, like a lot of the times Surgical is a bit too narrow and doesn't really work the way you think it does. Of course, sometimes it wins you the game, but it doesn't happen a lot, and it's a card that you want to play mostly when you are ahead. While Leave Spellbomb, since it provides card advantage, is always good. Of course, again, you kinda need to understand when to crack it, especially versus the Murktide version, because like they can just play Murktide at some point. So being able to well time and use Spellbomb is huge. But the card is just very good, even like versus Storm. That versus Storm, you don't want Surgical, you don't want Ghost Vacuum. So Spellbomb is a catch-all, and I'm happy to play 3. And the last card I want to talk is Engineered Explosives. So the card is mostly for Boros, but is better than Toxic Deluge or any other rat, because Boros is playing Chain to the Rocks or Static Prison in the sideboard. So being able to Engineer Explosive X1, you can also destroy the enchantments, and sometimes you can even just destroy the enchantments. But like I had a discussion today with Max, so the card might be even good versus Breach, because of course they rely a lot on 0 mana rocks, so moxes and bubbles and stuff like that, clues, etc. So you can just remove everything, and sometimes you can just Explosive X1 to kill Tamillo. I found myself being dead to Tamillo a lot, so I think I want something versatile. But the card is also valuable, like versus Broadscale, that you can just play that X1, kill the Blade, and deny them to combo. Or like in other matchups, Explosive is just very strong, and I think it's even better than Meltdown, just because you can just do it instant speed. And like
Yeah, the instant speed is nice, and also the flexibility, like you mentioned, of being able to like against energy blow up their stuff, especially in the Oculus list. Like if there's an Oculus under a Static Prison or Chain to the Rocks, then the explosives is very good. Uh, in the Murktide list, it's like it's a little worse, but it's still solid. And then
yeah,
the other
exactly.
concern is, yeah, Jules just said it in the chat, but like I'm always very concerned about Urza's Saga. I know Pygonti is a little bit less concerned than I am, but I feel like I lose to that card 100% of the time. That's like the reason I lose to these decks is always Urza's Saga just making constructs. So having extra ways to cleanly, you know, deal with that is huge for me. So if the card has flexibility beyond Urza Saga, that's just upside. But like having that backup mode of some way to deal with the Urza Saga is going to be very good for us.
Yeah, yeah, that's a theme for sure. Also, like the last card that I want to talk is Consigned to Memory. I just think this card is a must, and I think I can even see myself playing 4. Mostly because I think Consigned to Memory is good versus all the tier 2 decks that are Amulet, Eldrazi, anything artifact related, and it's just very flexible, and yeah, of course it's very good versus Belcher too. But I think this card is like very very real. It's not worth to main deck because of course I don't expect those decks to be well positioned at my regional, but I can see playing even 4. And like I think one card I want to talk specifically about my list is Picklock, because like playing all those cards, those specific answers make this card shine. So I think playing Picklock is probably worth. I'm not sure I will register to my RC, but I will keep you updated. But yeah, I'm liking this configuration. Yeah, and also Rhinos of course. Yeah, of course I'm playing a couple of cards versus Rhinos, so Explosive and Consign. But also I'm playing a Jailer. I'm playing Chalice. Jailer is huge versus Storm. I expect Storm to be very popular, I think, just because again it's a cheap deck, and it's a deck that people like to play apparently, and it's good. It's good versus Boros. It's good versus Breach. So I just want to have one silver bullet. Same for Chalice. Chalice is very good versus Breach, but it's also like good versus Rhinos, good versus those like pet decks people play. And I think like there is probably some value in playing a similar sideboard with a lot of free off, but also with some one-offs that are similar, but they solve different matchups. Because especially since we are playing blue, a lot of people will just try to play around what we do, and it makes their life more difficult. That's why I think it's probably fine to play a counterspell as well, because then it's really difficult to foresee what we are doing.
Yeah. I think that covers it pretty well. So as you start to build your lists, I mean, feel free to copy myself and Pygontes as starting points, and then now you understand like the key theory behind those sideboard cards and why we find them important. Um, I think that pretty much covers everything. I see lots of questions going on in chat, so thank you everyone for engaging. Um, and yeah, flex spots, that's another good discussion. I think that discussion probably comes a little bit further down the line. Uh, as we figure out the matchups, like play with the core of the deck and then understand where we feel there are gaps, and then we can fill in the flex spots accordingly.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can theorize a bit, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
I felt like
So
I used Brazen Borrower and like Shoot the Sheriff as flex spots because I felt that those cards were strong in the mirror, but also like they have a decent floor versus any matchup of being like Borrower is a threat, and then Shoot the Sheriff is a 2 mana removal spell, so it's gonna be fine. But yeah, we can talk about those for sure. It's a key part to the list.
yeah, I think like my biggest thing is I want to keep proportion, so I want to have like 6 removals, and I want to have a number of mill spells, a number of cantrips, so and also a number of counters, of course. So I find myself trying to keep those proportion while building this list. So I think like for now the cards I'm not super sure if I want to register a Sablety. That is basically another counter spell. Of course the Boggart, the Picklock, the Pierce, and that's kinda it. I think the rest I'm sold on, mostly because, and maybe the Borrower, of course. I think like of course Borrower is basically the second Shoot the Sheriff, but yeah, as you said, I think Borrower was playing a very good role in the mirror, while also being a threat, especially versus like Belcher or those decks where you need to keep your mana up, and at some point you just slam this 3-1 and start to attack. But also like Borrower is sometimes just good versus like energy for bouncing a token, for bouncing a blocker, or stuff like that. And Picklock is just a better Thug Scour for 2 mana. So when I started to build the deck, I just said I don't need 4 Scours because I have Thuxes as a turn 1 play. And so on turn 1 I can either Thuxes, play a Survey land, counter something, or play Consider. And of course the addition of Thuxes made my list a bit more a bit less reliant on 1 mana spells. So I just added a Picklock, and the card in my testing was good. I think I can see adding more just to try out the card better. And then I just think that it's very important to play to do a spell each turn, or just to play like your lands and sequence your lands according to a curve, because you'd never want to waste mana, especially with this list with like the curve stops at 3. Then I'm playing Bogart because I wanted to have a 20th land, but I also wanted a threat and something that deals with the graveyard. So I can see this being an Spellbomb, because this is a cantrip, so counts like 1/3 of a land. But I want to try the Bogart. I think the Bogart is especially relevant because sometimes you can unearth it and exile a graveyard versus Flage. But if you need a land, you can just play that. Of course, it would be painful, but you're playing Darkslick, so I don't know. I just don't find myself losing games because I'm short on life. And of course, I'm not playing Counterspell or Murktide, so it's not a big problem to have another Black Source.
Yeah, I really like the Bogart. I actually am wondering in your list specifically, like if you've moved away from Murktide and Counterspell, if you can play 2 Bogart and maybe like less sync. It's difficult to have too many, black only lands, but the Bogart giving you some like another thing to unearth. Like even if were to mill the Bogart and then unearth it turn 2, it's like kind of a Delver of Secrets type thing, sort of. I mean, it seems nice, and then again having main deck answers to Flage is so important in the energy matchup for those games that like you don't win early on because Flage is coming. They've got 4 of them usually, and if you don't like unearth an Oculus on turn 2, it gets harder and harder in the late game for us to win
Yeah,
without
especially
having some ways to answer the Flage.
I'm playing no counters, so Flage
Yeah, yeah.
is a card.
Cool. FAQ, I guess. So if you are if you're interested in this program, definitely what you need to do is join the Metafy Mind Sculptors tier. That's where we're gonna focus the content. But if you don't think you have as much time, or you don't want to focus as much time towards Magic for whatever life reasons, which I totally understand, then we're still going to be posting, sideboard guides and everything before the RC. You just won't be as like involved in the actual focus testing piece of this and like some of those other sessions that we host. So totally up to you guys what you prefer. Um, we're going to be doing lots of, like times where people are playing matches in the Discord, and myself and Pygonti will be, spectating or commentating on the matches. So that type of stuff, if that's something that interests you, consider it like group testing slash coaching, I guess. It's a bit experimental, but I think it's going to work well. And if it doesn't, then we'll learn for the future and improve and iterate on the process as we go throughout these next couple of weeks. Um, but yeah, you just have to sign up for the Mind Sculptors tier if you're not already in there. And don't forget that if you were a previous Patreon, you have that discount code, which is going to make it almost free. And if you are not a previous Patreon, then there's the Delve 30 code that gives you 30% off. So yeah, we're trying to, make it accessible for people, and are excited to work with everyone. I Does anyone have any FAQs? Because I thought I tried to guess what your questions were, but if something's not clear to anyone, now is the time to speak up and we can answer your questions about anything.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think to answer Thug Duke, yeah, I think like if the program works, we can just try to prepare for even other events on Magic Online, especially like PTQs and stuff. So
Yeah,
yeah, I think
definitely.
like the biggest part is try to be more united as a community. So each one of us can do his little portion of job, and then like we, because even us as coach, we learn both from your questions and also from our like the job we do together. So I think it's also relevant for us as players, and so we try.
Yeah, definitely. Um, 100% agree, and I think that's a good point. Like, if this is successful and there's a lot of energy behind it, I don't see a reason why we wouldn't continue it moving forward. Um, I think long term, like that's part of the goal of the mind sculptors is for people who are really looking to like level up and focus more time on Magic. Going beyond just like having a sideboard guide is super valuable for like leveling up your total skill in Magic. So that's kind of like the differentiation between the tiers is we'll always be looking for the mind sculptor stuff that might take more time invested from both myself and Pygonti, but also more time invested from you, I guess is the best way to put it. So
Yeah,
know your own constraints. There are times where I'm very busy with work and outside life, and Magic has to be less of a priority. So, obviously that's the same for everyone here. But whenever you're available to invest more time, I think that's like the way to go. And I feel like I've learned a lot from, being on the pro tour this past, this season, I guess, and excited to kind of pass that on to you guys and give you guys a structure for testing because the testing in leagues just doesn't cut it. I'll be honest. Like it's helpful as a baseline to learn some things, but you're gonna get so much more value out of doing these like focused testing and then analyzing the matchup with your opponent afterwards. Those types of discussions add so much value to your testing that I think this is going to really help people get ready for the RC and go in feeling confident. Um,
yeah.
I don't have anything else to say,
Okay,
so
I would
Pi,
like.
you can wrap it up, bring us home.
Yeah, I think like I would just want to answer a couple of questions regarding cards. So um, that both asked about Bitter Triumph. So I personally tried the card a lot because a lot of people asked it, and also feed the cycle. Like those cards, like I think in a similar deck, you really need to understand that the drawbacks of those cards is huge, meaning that a lot of the times you don't have the Oculus to discard. So when it works, of course, it's amazing, but a lot of the times is not great. And I just think in modern you can't really afford to be down a card for a removal or just lose 3 life. That's really painful. I guess that I like to of course kill planeswalkers, but I don't think those cards worked. And but of course, like I can be I can try those cards again. Just didn't really like when I tried. And regarding Meltdown, I don't think the card is worth unless you are expecting Affinity. I don't think Affinity is a good deck, and I think Mystical Dispute, Consign to Memory, and Stern Scolding are very good versus those decks. Mystical Dispute can counter Kappa Cannoneer. Chalice of the Void, if you play that on turn 1, is huge also. And I think just playing Explosive is better. I think if the only card they can consider Splash is Pyroclasm, but I think it's not even worth because this deck is really, really much better in B colors. And if I want to play red at that point, I play just the Grixis version with looting. But if you play blue-black, your mana base is much better, and you take less damage, and the deck functions just miles better in terms of consistency, I mean. Can you guys share your thoughts on Tamio? Yes, I think Tamio might be good in max version, because max version tries to play a longer game, meaning that I think the average win comes from turn 5 plus, while in my deck I don't think you have time to capitalize on Tamio, because I don't play counterspell, meaning I never have mana open. If I play Tamio on turn 1, I'm not even sure I want to play that. I think every other card I play here that costs 1 is better than Tamio, and I really need to vote unfair game versus the unfair decks. So I can see Tamio being good like versus Belcher, I guess, but I'm not even sure about that. While I really want to play like Thoxis Frog as a curve versus all the decks. I think Thoxis Frog is the best curve you can have, so Tamio doesn't really fit it. Of course, Tamio was amazing in the looting version, because you can immediately flip it and then have a threat that wins the game. But here I'm not super good, super in love with the card, and eventually, like even in testing with other players, we kinda agreed on the outcome. Yeah, I think like in this Murktide deck, you can maybe cut a couple of cantrips to play a couple of Tamios. It's reasonable. Or maybe you can even cut the Harbingers and play the Harbingers in the sideboard. But I don't know, like, of course, it's difficult to rebalance. And what else? Yeah, like regarding Kaito, a lot of people are asking about Kaito. I want to test Kaito. I think, of course, it would require a very different build. I don't know if someone shared here today with me, or it was in the regional testing group I'm testing with. But yeah, I just saw a super cool Kaito list, and yeah, I wanted to...
Okay, we'll test it. Twist my arm, fine.
Yeah, I don't know if I can share, but yeah. Okay.
We don't need their list. We'll make our own. I've got ideas. Okay, we should wrap this up. I think we said it's going to be an hour, so I know people have other commitments, and I don't want them to have FOMO.
Yeah,
but we'll have much more discussions.
I will just share these. So yeah, for Kaito.
Cool. Yeah, with the Tamio, that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I appreciate all the people watching this kickoff, and I think a lot of people will also watch it, watch the VOD. So I'm really excited to start to work with you, and yeah, I think we are rocking, and we'll do great things for the RC.
Yep, awesome. All right, thank you guys.
So for any questions, as always, just tag us in the proper channels, and we will answer and help you, and then we can just figure out the next meetings. Okay, goodbye, good night, have a nice day if you are in Japan, have a nice evening if you are in the US, and like here is almost midnight, as you can see. So yeah, bye.